Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our panel today, The Flesh Made Word, the State of Catholic Publishing Today. We are very blessed, and I'm very excited about this panel. We are blessed to have three wonderful publishers with us to discuss the topic in all its forms. We have Joshua Hren from Wiseblood Books, Katy Carl from Word on Fire's Luminar imprint, and Marianne Miller from Presence, a journal of Catholic poetry. And if you don't know me, I am Rhonda Ortiz. I am the new editor-in-chief of Dappled Things. I took over from Katy this summer, and we are preparing to celebrate our 20th year. So if you're curious about us, come find me in the vendor hall. And I'm also the founding editor of Chrism Press. We publish a wide range of YA and adult fiction, from popular to literary. So if you have a dystopian, magical realism, romantic, space opera, murder mystery, please come see me. If you need the home for that, come see me afterward. All right, let me introduce our speakers today. I'll start with Katy. Katy Carl is editor at Word on Fire Literary, writer-in-residence at the University of St. Thomas, Houston, senior affiliate fellow of Penn's Program for Research on Religion and Urban Civil Society, and editor emeritus of Dappled Things magazine. She is the author of As Earth Without Water, a novel, Fragile Objects, short stories, and Christopher Beha, a novelist in a post-secular world, among other works. Her writing has appeared in both religious and secular outlets, including Church Life Journal, I haven't had enough coffee to speak Greek this morning, Evangelization and Culture, Genealogies of Modernity, Fair Forward, Notre Dame Magazine, Public Discourse, St. Louis Magazine, Windhover, and others. Next, we'll have Marianne Miller. She is, again, with Presence at Caldwell University. Marianne Buddingberg Miller is professor of English at Caldwell University in Caldwell, New Jersey, and founding editor, I just said that, an annual international print poetry journal that publishes new poems and translations, interviews, book reviews, and essays on poetry informed by the Catholic faith. She is editor of St. Peter's B-List, contemporary poems inspired by the saints, which came out from Ave Maria Press in 2014. She's the fall 2019 selection of America Magazine's The Catholic Book Club. She frequently teaches a Catholic Writers of Literature course and a journal editing class that engages students in reading submissions to Presence. I'm so glad I got to meet you this time around. It's really lovely. And we also have Joshua Hren. Joshua Hren is founder and editor of Wiseblood Books and a co-founder of the Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing at the University of St. Thomas, Houston. Joshua regularly publishes essays and poems in such journals as Los Angeles Review of Books and First Things, America, and Public Discourse. Joshua is the author of 10 books, including How to Read and Write Like a Catholic, the novels Infinite Regress and Blue Walls Falling Down, and the theological aesthetical manifesto, Contemplative Realism. Joshua's more than a matter of taste, the moral imagination, and the spirit of literature is forthcoming. Thank you, and please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm going to start us off with an analogy, and it's going to be a familiar one. The people sitting at this table for many years have been attempting, and I hope succeeding, in doing exactly what Dana Gioia asked us to do in the end of his landmark essay, The Catholic Writer Today, returning to the abandoned neighborhood of Catholic literature in hopes that we might be able to fix it up for ourselves and our community. That urban metaphor for refurbishing a neighborhood is profound and pervasive, and in a way it's complete in itself. But I've started to think about it also in partnership or in community with another metaphor by another arts leader, Makoto Fujimura, who talks about the phenomenon of the cultural estuary in his book, Culture Care. And the metaphor that Fujimura is developing is more obviously focused on the natural world. If you're not familiar with what an estuary is, it's a specific kind of environment at the meeting of fresh and salt bodies of water. There's a particular balance of salinity, a particular balance of nutrients, very narrow sort of ranges of temperature, tends to be a more moderate place where certain species spend their entire lives. Other species come there to reproduce, to spend part of their life cycle, part of their year in that place, and some merely visit occasionally, flying by to get what they need before they go back out into the larger world. And it strikes me that what we're building is, in some ways, it is a city built on an estuary, right? They're both metaphors, I think, can live well together. And I, in fact, have a specific physical environment in mind when I think about this. Not only the one that I grew up in on Mobile Bay in Alabama, but also South Padre Island and other places on the Texas coast where I'm living now. There's specific places where there's a real need to balance the human needs of the built environment and the specific natural preservation needs, right, of the environment that the built environment is relying on and being nurtured by, right? It strikes me that the life of Grace is in a way the estuary, right, where the neighborhood is in some ways the human effort, right, the built environment, but then that's also being built from what is given. Right. So there are just a couple of things that I want to say specifically in terms of how I think we can practice in this this neighborhood that we've renovated for ourselves. Practice in this neighborhood the concept of culture care that Fujimura asks us to practice, and one is that we just need to continue to build things and not break them. We live in a time that is a bit obsessed. I might even want to say monomaniacally obsessed, both with sort of elaborate and inhuman scaled building efforts that serve themselves more than they serve the human common good. I also want to say that our time is obsessed in a certain way with breaking things that seem not to be working. And I just want to implore us once again, although everyone in this room has heard it ad nauseum, to please ask why the fence is there before you start tearing it down. And that's also for myself. It's easy to forget that we ourselves are living stones in something that we're not building, but that is being built with us by another will, another agency, right? And to go along with that insight, I also want to ask my fellow artists to please take care of their interior lives, because those in many ways are the natural environment from which we create. And if the interior natural environment is polluted, then the art that arises from that is also going to come out distorted, shadowed in ways that maybe don't necessarily always express the exact aesthetic transposition of evil that we were talking about yesterday in the comments of the MFA panel, but that contribute to increasing the darkness in the world rather than shining a light into it. So in that effort, we want to rely on filtering realities. An estuary is filled with filters, filtering species like seagrasses that pull the toxins out of the water, filtering species like oysters that oysters are something that Fujimura focuses in on as part of his analogy, right? They're sort of pulling out what shouldn't be there and putting in what should, right? So where do we see those realities, the seagrasses, the oysters? Where are we filtering out what might be harmful from the larger world that's coming in from outside? And where can we find spaces to be open to what's beneficial from the outside world? There are channels, right? There are avenues of entry so that we're not completely closed off from, or we're not sort of building a fortress or an enchanted enclosure with our city, but we're building something that's open to positive influences and yet shelters us from negative ones. And finally, we're sticking with the nature metaphor. I think the reality of storms that we don't control, and that we have to weather as best we can and rebuild after. It's a live one for many of us right now, but something that shouldn't frighten us. We shouldn't feel that when the storm comes, all is lost and there will never be a rebuilding. We live a faith that is specialized in regeneration and resurrection. And so with that reality, I'm going to turn things over to my colleagues to talk about some of the specifics of the various projects that we're engaged in, and we're hoping to just open a conversation about how each of us in our ways has been engaged in this larger labor together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katy. And I would like to begin with an extension of the metaphor that Dana left us with at the end of the Catholic Writer today, which is that this crumbling immigrant neighborhood seems like something on the one hand that ought to just be left to decline, and that there's something almost nostalgic about clinging to it. When I found it, and yet, when you set your hand to restructuring it and refurbishing it, immediately other people begin to join in that labor, and you look around and you're surrounded by friends. I think that we can't underestimate the significance of literary friendships that have developed in the last 11 years since that essay was published, precisely because we have all tried in our own way, and sometimes certainly failed, to, while pursuing our own literary projects, transcend them to put our hands toward a common plow, a common good. And when I founded Wiseblood, there was quite a kind of comical literalization of the metaphor of the crumbling immigrant neighborhood, in the sense that I was literally living in a kind of an old Catholic ghetto in Milwaukee, where, one of the wonderful things about competing ethnicities of Catholics who hated one another is that then you'd have a beautiful Polish church on this side of the street and a beautiful German church on this side of the street. They wouldn't talk to each other, but you can actually enter both churches and not get killed. At least not if you make sure not to go outside after 8 p.m. when dusk comes in Milwaukee, in that particular neighborhood where people were getting their hands chopped off in the alleyway. And so just to give you a sense, it quite literally was a crumbling neighborhood. And I had just finished my doctorate. Some of you have heard this story, so forgive me for the redundancy. But I had finished my doctorate, and roughly around this time had sending out applications. Of course, there are 200 applicants for every academic position. And I applied to become a barista because we had 2 small children at this time, and we just needed something. They told me I was overqualified. And I tried to argue with them, which just shows that I was overqualified, because you can't make arguments. And sort of had the sense in returning from that maybe taking a greater risk was on the table, that it wasn't irresponsible, because I had tried to do the thing that was more officially, respectably responsible. And I had been editing Dappled things, which of course Katy brought into its own over the last decade and more. At that time, I'd been an editor, and coming across a lot of writers of faith whose work was startlingly good. And they all had the same kind of mantra, which was that when they tried to get their works published in the big houses, or even some of the small presses in this country, that they could not find a home for it. And I was shocked, because it was genuinely good. And there's this kind of tension, I think, in Christian literary circles, where sometimes Christians can be kind of filled with resentment over their own kind of place in the larger literary world. So we are kind of literary culture, as Dana has helped us to see, is already a subculture within this country. There's a steady decline in the amount of Americans who read one book per year that exactly pretty much corresponds. I won't say that it's an absolute causal correlation, but it corresponds with the amount of Americans who are getting college degrees. So do with that what you will. And so literary culture is already a subculture. So in a sense, a lot of what we're doing is preserving something that seems to be in decline, which seems like a concerning kind of act of nostalgia or denial in some ways. And yet, as I'll speak to momentarily, there's a sense in which I think we need to precisely lean into that and not try to make accommodations in order to sort of, meet people where they are. And I'll qualify that in a minute. But so I was living in this neighborhood, getting these wonderful submissions, and then I just thought, well, okay, something needs to be done. And I learned how to make books. If you remember, this was the days when Amazon was starting to publish these $2 editions of Jane Austen's classics, and then you'd buy the book and it would literally be 20 pages and it would be 2-point font, Pride and Prejudice. And so I wanted to make those kinds of books more beautifully. And now looking back at what I thought was beautiful, I mean, it was atrocious. But I spent just innumerable unremunerated hours working 12-hour days to get Wiseblood off of the ground. Now, here's where sort of the hand of God comes in. Dana has this wonderful image in one of his poems of God as a choreographer of entrances and exits. And he also has taught us to see the ways in which we're trying to build the city of God. Now, the thing that I would add to that is that the city of God is also trying to build us or invite us into its citizenry. And without my knowledge, I had founded, without knowing anything at all, I'd accidentally founded Wiseblood on the feast day of Blessed James Ducat, who's one of the patron saints of Catholic publishing. He was alive during the Recusant period in England, and he was put to death because of his efforts to publish Catholic books. And also without my knowledge, in that same year, around that same time, Dana Joya had published The Catholic Writer Today in First Thing. So the things that he was calling for was exactly what Wiseblood was doing, and I didn't know who he was. And so once I found out who he was and read his work, I wrote him a 14-page letter. And to my surprise, instead of tearing it up into confetti, he actually responded and became an immediate friend, mentor, and patron of the press. And we began to publish a series of Wiseblood essays in contemporary culture that really, through his book as the first one, put Wiseblood on the map. I think if that hadn't happened, Wiseblood would no longer exist. It would have been basically the equivalent of a 90s garage band that didn't make it as far as Pearl Jam or Nirvana. And so now I'm happy to say that we have this whole kind of series of Wiseblood essays in contemporary culture, very beautifully designed so that the typography becomes a kind of work of art. I'll just move from there to give you a sense of some of the other things that we're up to. Some of them extraordinarily foolish. Hamita van Doderer's double volume novel. This is just one. I just brought one volume because I thought that if I brought both volumes, the table might break. Because this does actually double as a sort of form of self-defense. So if you don't read anymore, then you can at least use it to hurt someone if they're hurting you. And as I hope you can see, and I hope you agree, and it's not just a matter of taste, this is an extraordinarily beautiful book. I take no credit for that. But the idea is, okay, we are in a time of kind of literary decline, and in some ways, in the sense of mass culture, is what I'm referring to. And so we have our work cut out for us in terms of the kinds of readers that we're seeking. But if we can kind of make the book itself an artifact, something that you look at it and you hold it, you feel it, and the form of it convinces you of its beauty before you even open it. Of course, the old adage, you can't judge a book by its cover, is absolutely wrong. And the whole idea of beauty is on the inside, it's what's on the inside that counts, is absolutely not entirely true, because there's all kinds of complicated and vexing correlations between externals and internals that are much more complicated than that. And so one of the things that we've tried to do is to bring back into print books like The Doderer, or like Bernanos Under Satan's Sun, which is also another beautiful cover, or like Proust's, Marcel Proust's, Death Comes for the Cathedrals, which is a kind of a defense of the preservation of French churches for liturgical use at a time when the French state was trying to turn them into museums. And so on the one hand, we've brought works that are kind of dead back into a second life, but then we've also tried to champion upcoming writers like Trevor Kirvan Merrill. Let me see if I can find these. We published his debut novel, Minor Indignities. Sally Thomas. We published two books by her, The Blackbird and Other Stories, and also Works of Mercy. And then Katy Carl, who's sitting right next to me, her debut novel, As Earth Without Water, and also Fragile Objects, which is another beautiful book. But working with Katy largely came about because Wiseblood also looked around and said, okay, it seems like there are a lot of people who I'm also talking to who kind of say that they have a manuscript in their desk, that they've been sitting on for 5 years or 10 years, or maybe not sitting on, but sort of trying to bring to fruition, but they couldn't sort of make it happen because in some people's cases it would be a matter of, I have 4 or 5 children and I'm homeschooling them, and so there's not a lot of time. Toni Morrison got up at 3 in the morning and somehow seemingly managed to still be a good person, but most of us can't do that. And so then I started to raise funds for the Wiseblood writer in residence without a residence. So, in the novel Wiseblood, there's a famous, character who goes around trying to found the Church of Christ without a church, the church without a church, excuse me. So Wiseblood didn't necessarily have the funds to, get a full residency built, but we were able to set aside the monies to rent an Airbnb, to do kind of video conferences that were devoted to a kind of combination of learning the craft and then also just giving extensive editorial advice for about 10 days. I agree with those sentiments entirely, by the way. I think all of creation is in fact groaning for our redemption. So there's not a better metaphor for our existence than that. And Katy and I, this is where I think our friendship and our common pursuit of artistic excellence really sort of solidified through that. I mean, I couldn't have imagined. I didn't really know Katy's writing as well as I do now, but there's such a simpatico kind of mutual kind of affinity between our aesthetics, which we have come to call kind of contemplative realism now. And the thing about publishing is, of course, it's a gift both ways, and all of this is a gift. I hope that we can all see this. I mean, we shouldn't be here. This is unbelievably amazing that any of this is happening at all. This should not be happening. But that, in a certain sense, Wiseblood, I think, helped to bolster the career of young writers like Katy Carl, and also it's the case that Katy Carl's work helped to bolster Wiseblood's reputation because it was so excellent on an artistic level that it was getting reviewed in Los Angeles Review Books, for example, not just in the Catholic sort of ghetto of Dappled Things and company.
Along with Joshua's own novel, I have to add.
Goes without saying. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. So, should I cut it short, or 1 or 2 more minutes? Yeah. Is that all right? 2 more minutes. Okay. So along with that kind of I call the residency a kind of miniature MFA for those who can't take 2 years out of their life to get an MFA, or who just want to avoid MFA culture at all costs, which I completely recommend, even though I'm teaching in an MFA and founded one. I'm very sympathetic. But I think that, again, there's a kind of a goal here. The conference is titled Ever Ancient, Ever New, right? And I mentioned this the other day in one of the panels, St. John Henry Newman's notion of, right, sort of exercising conservative action on the past, because especially when you're living in an age of novelty. But on the other hand, the novel as a form, as you can tell from the name, novel, implies the goodness of the new, right? There's a way in which, in other words, we absolutely need to preserve the literary inheritance that has been handed us because it's absolutely not going to be preserved by anyone else. These books are not going to preserve themselves. We cannot take for granted that they will be around in 10 years, right? Private libraries at different periods in the history of the world have actually been the source of preserving civilization, not just the libraries of monks, but also private libraries and homes, as I think it was a recent piece in Front Porch Republic by Nadia Williams, I think it was, argued. And yet again, as I mentioned, there's also the need to cultivate the new. But what I've found in terms of looking at most contemporary novels and fiction and poetry is I review them regularly, and there's much to admire and appreciate in them, but it's sort of like have to do a lot of straining. And what we wanted to do was to give people books like Katy's and others that provide us with kind of mediating metaphors, speaking in the idiom of our time that can kind of help us to navigate with a depth perception all the complexities of a world that is ours, so that when you, in a certain sense, it's good to be able to read a book like von Noderer's Demons, which he wrote over the course of 20 years when he converted from Nazism to Catholicism and revised his novel sort of as a reflection of that conversion. It's good. It's of course essential for us to avoid presentism. In order to and to do that, we have to figure out how to build bridges across into other eras and other works of art. But it's also essential that we have works of literature that give us this kind of idiom of our time, so that when you close the book and you open the book, there's a kind of seamlessness between you say, yes, this is the world that I actually inhabit, and this is a mediating metaphor that helps me figure out how I ought to live and where God is at work in subtle and usually artfully indirect ways, orchestrating our entrances and exits. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Marianne Miller. I'm just have to say, just to kind of dovetail off of Katy's and Joshua's a bit, I'm so grateful for this literary friendship that has occurred over these last, you've mentioned 11 years or so. It's amazing. Presence Journal, I probably should, for those of you who don't know, give you a little history of Presence first as well. We did spring directly from the first of the Catholic Literary Imagination Conferences at USC in 2015. During a panel at that conference, someone raised her hand and said, we don't have a journal devoted specifically to poetry, among Catholics. And Meredith McCann, who was with Dappled Things, happened to be on the panel, and she kind of gave us her blessing, if you will, by saying, yes, we receive so many poems each year that we don't have the space to, bring to publication, and so we sort of identified that niche. And then also Joshua mentioned, our work kind of springs from Dana's Catholic Writers Today essay. We then also created space for book reviews. So we have a large number of reviews of small individual collections of books each year. And we're an annual. We come out in April for National Poetry Month. But my role here today is to really give you some examples of writing that they've been talking about, which has been a joy. And we've kind of, speaking of friendships, we've kind of worked together on selections that we think will be good, to illustrate some of the points. So just have a few things for you today. And but anyway, so I'm going to try to figure out the timing of it, which is not my strong point, but I'll give it a shot. Joshua just mentioned, and it's so important, this idea of we're publishing contemporary work, right? So we're interested in, as you said, the idiom of our time and how we can get across God's grace through that language. And so so one thing, and I thought, in another point, he also made, is how we also want these contemporary works to be a part of the unbroken continuum, right, with the Catholic tradition and the Catholic. So a couple of things Joshua mentioned, and I learned this. I teach Dante every year, and of course I'm so used to talking about the influence of Virgil, of course, and the Aeneid on Dante. But one of the things that Wiseblood has brought to light through Dana Gioia's translation of Seneca, The Madness of Hercules, is that Dante was also influenced by Seneca, a little bit later writer. So we have some lines from this translation, and very much in our language right today, but wonderful translation. So this is just a small part of it. But it's this image of hell, right? And this idea, I'm always struck by how Dante makes hell a place on earth. We go down into the earth. And I talk to my students about it being, just a way of believing in hell, that it really exists, And so these lines get that across as well. There is a famous cliff on Sparta's coast, a headland covered by a thick-grown wood, where Cape Tainaris juts into the sea. It's here the mouth of Hades opens up. The high cliffs split apart, and a huge cave, a gaping chasm, stretches its vast jaws and makes an entrance wide enough for all mankind. At first, the way is not entirely dark. Some daylight filters down and gives the cave that same bleak iridescence the sun shows in an eclipse. But gradually, the path descends into unending twilight. Your vision blurs, and only feeble streaks of red and violet shimmer in the dark, like the last fading embers of a sunset. But then the pathway opens to a vast and empty place, a hazy nothingness that all the human race must come to fill. There are no grassy meadows bright with flowers, no fields of ripe corn swaying in the wind, no soft green vistas for the eye, or groves where branches bend with slowly sweetening fruit, no breezes spiced with odors of the plum, but only wasteland everywhere, the fields unwatered and untilled, the soil exhausted, and nothing moving on the silent land. And this is how life ends, this barren place, this country of despair, where no wind blows and darkness never lifts, with hopeless sorrow twisting every shadow. Dying is bitter, but eternity confined in this black place is worse. So it's really, you don't want to go there, right? If you knew the consequences of sin, right? And that's Dante's objective, So thank you for bringing this influence upon Dante to my life and my teaching.
By a minor poet, it was
Yeah,
a
that
rough
minor
publication
poet,
decision.
or minor translator. Right. So then in thinking about bringing a few things from presence to the table, and thinking about the idioms of our time, I wanted to read to you a poem by Angela Alamo O'Donnell, who engages with Dante very much, and happens to have a poem in this latest issue of Presence called The Journey. And she begins with an epigraph that the first three lines of the Inferno, right? Midway in the journey of our life, I came to myself in a dark wood, for the straight way was lost. But listen to this language. She sort of is speaking to Dante, chiding him, right? He's there, Virgil's there to break his pride, and so I love this tone. It's playful, it chides Dante, it reminds us to obviously break our own pridefulness. So anyway, here we go. You're not the first to be so lost, and will not be the last. You're not the first to count the cost of being ruined, outcast, from the city that you called your own. You might pray and fast, but never can you go back home. A new path lies ahead, a life you'll have to lead alone. And so you dream instead of an imagined friend pulled straight out of your head, a poet who can mend the bent and broken life you've led, a poet who can send you places that the small soul dreads, the world of reckoning with the living and with the dead, who will teach you to sing a song of loss and then of grace, relieve you of your mourning and lead you to the face of her you've loved so long and well, redeem you from disgrace, but first you'll have to go through hell. So there's great tone to that. Speaking of grace, one of the things we talk about a lot, I think, is the way that we want to help our readers see how grace comes to us in so many unusual ways, right? But both the uncanny, but also through the quotidian, and even the mundane, So there are just plentiful examples of this, and it's so hard to narrow it down, but it's also been very fun to see, examples from all of us. I think one of the, this is a beautiful poem. Maybe I'll start with this one. This is a poem by James Matthew Wilson called To an Unborn Child, and it is in a Word on Fire book called his latest book of poems, St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds. You may have run across this over the weekend for sure. But in this poem, it's a sonnet, or close to one anyway, and it certainly is an everyday experience. So let me just read it. I'll talk a little bit about it. To an Unborn Child. Storm clouds move in and darken all the house. The morning paper on the kitchen table dim, where I've been reading some reporter's grouse at things already bad, now growing grim. Most of the prodigies agree with him. I rise to light a lamp and hear the thunder and watch the first drops thudding on the lawn. Your mother joins me. Here we stand in wonder between the hour that marks your life's first dawn and that one still obscure we're counting on. And I know another concept that we talk about a lot is avoiding the sentimental, right? And so many poems run the risk of that, right? Especially one perhaps about expecting a baby, an innocent child. But it's so interesting how in Catholic writing, many times, this idea of birth is bound up with death, right? And it keeps the sentimentality at bay, And when I read this poem, I just really was moved to read one from Presence, because not only does thunder figure into it and a lot of things, but there's also that impetus in the writer to not be sentimental, to remind us of death at the same time as this wonderful grace that fills our lives. So this poem is called Thunderhead by Dave Filippo, and it's much different in terms of style. James's has got the strength, the brevity, right? The power of brevity. This is a narrative poem, and maybe that's one thing I need to say about Presence. We have a lot of different forms. We come out annually, so we have to fit a lot in, at once each year. So we have a lot of different styles in ours. This is a narrative poem, Thunderhead. Last week at the supper table, I was daydreaming after the meal, looking and not looking through the dining room's wavy glass as old as its farmhouse, which is to say almost a century older than me. As I'd been doing all afternoon, I was mulling the word radiance, how to use its Latinate voluptuousness in a poem in a way that wouldn't seem cheap. When my husband said, "Your face, it's glowing," and I said, "Well, maybe I'll just sit here in this light forever." And he said, "No, it's not that. I noticed it earlier, in the kitchen too." At my age, I knew it couldn't be youth, so maybe the word itself was incandescing. I mean, what if, in choosing words to ponder, we choose our countenance too? The simple way switching out a blackened bulb for a new relights the shade, the room, in which case you have another think coming, as my mother was fond of saying, could actually mean something to look forward to. The way those thunderheads rolled in yesterday evening between rains, white, gray, old lavender rimmed in gold, cumulus, piled so high they made the sky into a great Midwestern sea, and thunder into a great whale sounding its depths, sights and sounds one might expect when being born into the next. The setting sun diffusing gold through the humid air, light pouring over bean field and barn, pasture, cat, every tree and me, summer robe and flip-flops, out in that light, stepping through wet grass and the aroma of wet grass, searching, camera in hand, trying to find a way to capture it all, giving up, just standing there, letting radiance thunder through my head. So also this, grace coming through the everyday, right? You may have, maybe it's good to pause for a moment, you may have also sort of picked up on a kind of comic tempo in a lot of the work. It's always bears, reminding us that the Catholic imagination is really ultimately a comic vision, right? It's the Christian story has a happy ending, through Christ's suffering, there's redemption. And also, just that idea of laughing at the ridiculousness of sin, right? That's ultimately powerless. So I think, we hear a lot of strands of sort of laughing at ourselves in this too. To try to sort of create a segue here, another sort of strand, that we've talked about and tried to prepare for, is this idea of really sort of this simplicity in poetry and the value of that, as really kind of conveying divine design. And I know we wanted to be sure to include Dappled things in the reading, and I don't want to overlook that. One of the poems that is in this current issue, which is a beautiful cover, by the way, if you haven't been to their table yet, you should go, is a poem by Marjorie Maddox called Simple. Its epigraph is after Mother Julian. Prayer, cat, bed, desk. A simple cell, that's all. Her will was just to serve. Through words, the word. Her lifelong call, simple. Cat, prayer, bed, desk, walls, cell. Outside, Norwich, Black Death. The will to burn with prayer preserved her pure. With just her cat, she prayed. Her cell, a wall of will. Her all to serve. So very, very contemplative, right? And leads us to that. This poem, for some reason, the rhythms of it kind of reminded me of a poem in Presence that has that kind of simplicity, but is deceptively so, right? They're all deceptively simple in many ways. There's a lot of thought. And this is called Sunday Without End. It's a translation from the Spanish of Julio Martinez Masanza, translated by Don Bogan. Sunday Without End. On Saturday, when so many things happen, I am the watchman sleeping by the tomb. On Saturday, when nothing particularly needs to happen, things are happening. Saturday was the law. The world was perfect. I served the law, but poorly, since when I needed to stay awake, I fell asleep. On the perfect Saturday of the world, on the final perfect Saturday, when the law and the soul were enough, when the soul rejoiced in its service, on the final perfect Saturday, prelude to a Sunday without end. There's also, obviously, we talk a lot about the ways that poems are prayers, and in many different forms. And so we also wanted to share some of those with you as well. And let me make sure I'm trying to see what I want to make sure I put one of Father Murray's in. So this is, Light at the Torn Horizon by Father Paul Murray. It's a Word on Fire book. And this poem was chosen by Katy, and it's beautiful. It's called doing here?
Marianne, are we doing in the future?
Is it, yeah, let's see, I'm losing my place here now. 43. Yeah, that's the one. Thank you. Yeah, okay. Yes, it's called In the Future. Should it happen that my thoughts of you, of your fire, and of your beauty find themselves trapped in a predictable, dull pattern of words and start to lose all depth, all freshness, help me, O living word, to teach those thoughts that need to die, how to die, and those dead words, how to live. It's really beautiful. 2 more, okay, good. So yeah, so to kind of pair with that, this poem is by Andrew Callis. It's called Settling the Storm, and it's from Presence. Still me as you stilled the wild sea, terror-teethed with waves cresting over the edges of the boats, the water black like deep dreams possessed by some dark thing, that I might sink, that I can, deep-figured, soar up toward the sky. It's really beautiful. So I wanted, one thing I was hoping to be able to close with Katy reading some of As Earth Without Water, and I have it marked there. This idea of grace coming from uncanny places, right?
And for context, for those who aren't familiar with the novel, this scene is toward the end, and it's where this abused monk, Brother Thomas Augustine, his name in the world was Dylan Fielding, and he's a visual artist. He comes to the monastery only to be abused by a visiting priest and sort of healed by the community, but not in a complete way. There's something left to be desired. So this is from toward the end of the novel, and this is his recounting his memory of recounting his abuse to the internal investigators at the monastery who are looking into the matter, who've been brought in to look at the matter, right? The collar of the lawyer's white Oxford moves lightly against her throat as she leans a few degrees forward. She places her palms flat on the folder of case notes she's taking. If she wants him to feel better because she is not writing now, well, he does not feel better. Her trimmed nails have been painted a cloudy, bridal opal. Can you describe your injuries? Asks the lawyer in a voice of ice. He does not want to, Father Cyprian says, standing and stepping closer to Dylan as if in defense. Yes, Father, he does not want to. The question he wants to ask is, how do you heal after this happens? How are you whole again? And maybe she does not want to ask, maybe she merely must. But if it must be done, Thomas Augustine can describe his injuries, the rip in the ring of muscle, the pain that revisited daily so badly that at times he bit his arm to keep from crying out, the bleeding that trailed on for weeks. He watches the orchid skin under the lawyer's eyes contract as he piles details on details. Good, he thinks. He knows it is her job to make what was done to him as bad as it is, as bad as the jury should find it. But he feels obscurely that she should be made to pay for this, that someone should. The priests, like unshockable police, have heard it all before. He is no longer sure it hurts them, but he knows it hurts her. She looks younger than he is, much younger than he feels. He has to fight off a flash of hatred. How dare she sit there so untarnished? How dare she show her pain on her face? The orchid skin deepens with a hint of the blue veins beneath it. As he finishes speaking and she begins writing again, a silence falls. And in it, Thomas Augustine has plenty of time to see the tautening and blanching of Father Cyprian's face. The old priest's lips twist in disgust. And this twist breaks Thomas Augustine in two. He knows the twist is meant for the abuser and not for himself, and yet there is not enough space in his own mind to keep them apart. He could begin sobbing, but doesn't. Instead, he sits quite still. Feels the flow of the future subtly rearrange itself around him and knows he will not stay here. He has been at war with himself, and now the war is over. There has come peace, but not the kind he hoped for. He can forgive the old priest's disgust, but he cannot continue to live with it, to consume soup at the table across from it. He knows well, that Father Cyprian is at war now, that it has cost him a battle not to shout his rage and vengeance at the word penetrated. He knows what Father Cyprian's calm presence has meant to him until now. Safety, solidity, a show of strength his own father never displayed, and now that strength has broken, and Thomas Augustine must look for it elsewhere. That show of strength is now revealed at what it always maybe was, an illusion. As empty as his own sense of having been called to a way of life, Thomas Augustine thinks now, tasting bitterness with the thought. Thomas Augustine, who is he kidding? Dylan Fielding, prima donna, flaming attention whore. It is not who he is, but it is, he feels sure, how he is seen. Dylan feels tempted to start telling lies now, to endorse the claim the guilty priest had made to Father Isaiah's face. Nothing happened between us, the priest had said. That wasn't entirely called for. What would it be like to see Father Cyprian's face wrung out like a rag, the way it would fold in on itself if he believed, Dylan believed, that? Even now, Dylan cannot quite bring himself to commit this cruelty. He believes he would allow any harm to himself now to prevent it. If it would help anyone, he would accept a version of reality that would obliterate every good thought they had ever had about him. Instead, he holds to the story of what really happened, as much as he can remember of it, because he still would prefer that Father Cyprian not suffer any more than he must. Things are broken enough as they are. The lawyer's face grays a shade as she finishes taking down her account. She collects her papers, adjusts her cuffs, smooths to soothe herself the silver links in the apertures of her French cuffs. I think I have all that I need here, the lawyer says. I'll draw up a draft for your approval. With your signatures, we can move forward. There's a scattering. Dylan will never remember afterward how he makes his way from the conference room to the chapel after this. He will only recall lying there on the floor, hot-faced to cold stone, eyelids squeezed tight, forehead and nasal bone pressed to the hexagon-crossed sandal prints left by other men in the terracotta tile, in the posture he would have taken for the ordination, which now will not take place. For a long time to come, he will live inside himself, not on the ground in that garden, but grounded here in front of this altar. His soul will lie face down on the floor, under the shadow of the purple cloth draped from the lectern, in the quivering draught, looping through the rose ribbons, trailing off the candlelit wreath, smelling remnants of iron oxide in the red clay stains under his face, breaths of frankincense wafted from an altar he will never again serve. When it is time for the vigil mass, they will find him here. Two of them will have to hold him under the elbows and around the shoulders to walk him to his place in the choir. Until then, he will stay, face down in the knowledge that the next day will be Sunday, only 12 days before they place the cold ceramic child in the dusty yellow straw of the creche. Until the child is born, he thinks he will lie here on this floor. He will wait. He will not move until there arrives a purity of heart that will be new every morning, that will be strong enough to scour away the pain, to purge the horror. That was a doozy, guys. So let's do the hopeful thing now and have some questions.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. In the back. think Katy has some thoughts on this.
Sure, I'll bite. So I think because of having spent a few months now at Word on Fire, which I'm very grateful for, and which I think is in a very real way a testament to what has been happening here over the past at least 11, but I would say more years. There's such vibrancy here that a major mainstream Catholic organization is now interested in publishing literature and interested in the possibilities of that, both for outreach to minds that are not yet Catholic and for outreach to minds within the church that might be nourished by this, right? There's a real there's, in a very real sense, that is simply the fruit, one more fruit of this revival that that no single one of us can take credit for. And I think that there are many unsung or undersung heroes of, right. One of them I see sitting right there in the other row, my undergraduate philosophy teacher, Dr. Gregory Beabout, in a very real way. None of my participation in all of this would have taken place if not for Dr. Beabout's Christian personalism class and the opportunity to engage with Jacques Maritain's creative intuition in art and poetry and write the essay that became Self-Gift and the Vocation of the Literary Artist. So those kinds of stories, I think, need to continue to be told, right? Those heroes like Meredith McCann, whose name came up, our poetry editor at Dappled Things, who, because she lives with many small children, is kind of an undersung hero and someone whose voice we don't hear as much, or Bernardo Aparicio, without whom Dappled Things would simply never have come to be, but whose vision and whose insight and whose leadership have brought us to where we are. I think that goes maybe to what Jess is saying, and I want to ratify about being evangelists, not only to each other, but for each other, right? And lifting each other up. That is one of the major ways that I think we need to continue to sustain and preserve this literary culture by avoiding the kinds of traps that are common to secular literary culture, filtering out the vices, the jealousy, the rivalry, the envy that can mark those environments and distort them. A phrase that I keep hearing in other contexts that I think applies here is, the incentive structure is kind of destroyed. I think that's the case in many parts of literary, secular literary culture. That as we build our own, I hope we can avoid that trap and be genuinely edifying, not in the sense of forcing a conclusion that is a sort of proof text for doctrine, but edifying in the sense that it genuinely and organically builds up the body of Christ and the city of God, right, through our work. Yeah.
If I could just say a few more things on that point. I think that, for one thing I would say is, I don't think you can go from cosmopolitan to Horace directly. The great educator, John Senior, sort of famously said that the problem with the great books movement is that there's not the proper soil to receive the vastness that is in those great texts. And so if someone who barely knows how to read is given a copy of Horace, it's not surprising, and it's not entirely their fault that their eyes are going to roll over and they're going to go back to Twitter. And so what's needed is a kind of a cultivation of not just great books, but good books. And so I think that that's what I would describe most of all of these works that we're trying to publish as being. And I guess I would also just like to say a few remarks about the kind of mimetic desire dynamics of the literary world that Katy was kind of alluding to. 10 years ago, Dana said that what we really haven't done at that time was to, within the Catholic community, elect the most excellent among us and elevate them, right, for others outside of our lovely but limited ghetto to be able to behold. And I think that what I'm interested to see over the next 10 years is what will come next, because I think that we have actually done what Dana asked us to do. We have elevated those who are most excellent. But what that also means is that there are other people who have not been elevated. And the fact is that there are some writers who are more excellent than others. I know that this is America. I know that, we've read Tocqueville's Democracy in America, or wait, no, we haven't, but the insights could do us a lot of good because we're so obsessed with egalitarianism and a kind of a misconception of equality that sometimes what can result from the fact that some are elevated and others aren't is really this kind of resentment that it's not me up there, right? And I'm interested to see what will happen, how over the next 10 years, people will begin to, or will continue to do that work of elevation, even when it comes not for themselves, if that makes sense. Because we need to obviously transcend the kind of, the limits of a kind of boosterism, which is just kind of elevating everyone and everything that we know just because we know them and we're doing favors for them and they're doing favors for us, right? That's the worst possible thing that could happen. In fact, one of the weaknesses of literary culture right now is book reviews. We need many more book reviews, and we also need far fewer book reviews. We need far fewer book reviews that are puff pieces that don't reserve even a sentence or a paragraph for the limitations of the work that's being considered. Usually in every good and great work, there is some sort of imperfection, even in Dostoevsky's The Idiot, for example. And yet there's also a need, again, to kind of have that discriminating taste to separate the precious from the vile. And I think that one of the other weaknesses that we can kind of concede to is because we are cognizant of the fact that we are a subculture within a subculture, that we sort of idolize, publications and works and prizes that are given by the dominant literary culture, and are not willing to point out the weaknesses of those works. So, for example, in a recent review of Michel Houellebecq, I tried to treat it with great hospitality, his novel Annihilation, but also pointed out some of the very dark departures from a Catholic vision that novel contains. And so just trying to, again, as St. John Henry Newman's phrase, but learning how to separate the precious from the vile in the way that we talk about one another's works, I think is hugely important for the next 10 years.
Yeah, I want to give time for other questions too, but I wanted to dovetail just a couple of things. I thought it was interesting that Katy mentioned her own teacher, because I think of these answers to these questions in terms of like an academic. I teach at a small Catholic university, but no one there uses the term Catholic intellectual tradition. So just that idea is dying, and I think, so my answer, and again, this is just as a teacher at a small institution, it starts in the class, back in the classroom. We've got to get people, because you were saying you can't go from cosmopolitan to, Seneca or whatever,
Without a lot of Ritalin.
And, just put it down, pick one up. So what's happening from my perspective is that the love of those older texts is getting lost. And so I am constantly bemoaning that it needs to get back into the classroom. So that's my 2 cents. But anyway, more questions.
Dana.
Mary Ann, Joshua, and Katy have been very eloquent in terms of what they're doing for writers, what they're doing for the church, and what they're doing for the literary tradition. Could I ask them to give us some practical and specific examples of what this audience could do for them? We have a crowd of people here, and we need to be told how to help you.
I'm going to start with Joshua.
Oh, sure. I think that, again, it's, I had mentioned this earlier, but that I think that sometimes the work that we're doing can be taken for granted, in the sense that it's just going to keep appearing. And I don't mean to sound self-important in saying that if it disappeared, that our salvation is endangered or something like that. Certainly not. But I do think that all of us here have made untold sacrifices. Certainly this is the work primarily of Providence, but untold, unremunerated hours. And again, Wiseblood Books sales have tripled in the last 3 years. We're getting more orders. It used to be like 80% of our orders came through Amazon, 20% through our own website. Now it's 50-50, which is incredible. And that means that's thanks to you, our patrons and our readers. And our authors, you do more justice to our authors when you buy through us rather than through Amazon, because Amazon takes a massive cut so that you're left with a few cents. And so buying directly from the publisher. Also, though, sacrificially giving. I mean, I think that it probably goes without saying, but in order to do what any of us are doing, market metrics are not enough. You know, Farrar, Straus, and Giroux was able to publish Flannery O'Connor and T.S. Eliot because, as my friend Trevor Merrill told me, they published first a health book. It was a book on dieting or something like that, right? And they made a killing off of that one book. So we're still looking for that. If you have a great 5 tips on how to tone your soul through eating or something like that, then maybe that will be the breakthrough for us. But until something like that happens, and we are being judicious, I promise you, in thinking about books, we have to, so in order to make it work, we have to publish books that take risks, like the double-volume Doderer that costs a lot of money to make and few people will buy. And we also have to publish books that as many as possible people will buy. But again, and then just one final thing that I would say is that there are people who who take their reading cues from Oprah's list, right, rather than from the carefully curated canon of Catholic literature. And so I'm not even talking about encouraging your friends and family if you know that they're readers in the direction of Wiseblood or Word on Fire or Presence specifically, but just returning them to these great lists that have already been accumulated on the great Catholic literary works and getting them started there, because there's a real dearth that needs to be remedied.
Can I cut in a little bit too, because I have something to say about this. Sorry. One of the things that we've paid attention to at Chrism is just the type of readers, and especially we were talking a lot about Catholics in the pew, and this problem of how do you bring people through. There are a number of very pious people who won't read fiction at all because I've been told, I don't have time for fiction. I only have time for my spiritual reading. So there's a group of that. There's also a group of, again, faithful Catholics who don't know Catholic fiction exists at all, and they gravitate to Christian market fiction. Okay, so that's a different kind of vision of faith, and it's a faithful. These are people. I know a number of people who write in the Christian market. These are people who take their craft seriously, but they just have a different way of expressing that, and they have an expression. Their expression of faith is through the dialectic, right? And ours is largely sacramental. So so there's different things that there's almost a marketing problem. I like marketing people. Okay, they have their place, and they're gonna make this happen. So thank you. Next question.
If I could just say really quickly, one other thing that I think is really significant on that. Again, I think a press like Wiseblood or Word on Fire's imprint, I presume, will be willing to take those kinds. So there's financial risks, and then there's aesthetical risks. Like typically, the problem for a long time was that a serious Catholic literary artist fell between 2 stools, right? The New York publishing industry and Christian literature, which typically, I would go further and say that it's actually doing damage to the very family values and evangelical things that it's trying to do. It's actually making those things unattractive because it's doing them artlessly. And so again, there's presses that we all respect for doing what they're doing in publishing theological or catechetical works. But I've been told, by some of those presses that they weren't willing to take my own titles, for example, because my books, my novels, were too avant-garde is the way that they interpreted them. But it was funny because it would be like, well, that would be avant-garde in 1930, maybe, right? And so, the church takes a long time to catch up with what's going on oftentimes, and that's usually a really good thing, but it can also be a liability.
Isn't après-garde the term that David Foster Wallace used for, or après-garde? To very quickly add my 2 cents onto the topic of what readers can do for us before we move on. Buy books for your friends, give them as gifts, and find ways to discuss them in community. I think the communal aspect of this can't be undersold or underemphasized. Yeah.
That's what I was going to say, too. And poetry is already a hard sell next to fiction, so pass the word about poetry. We actually have poets. We publish poets from all over the country, even internationally. I've had poets say, oh, we'll have a reading in our area, and I don't have to be at everything, right? So, people coming forward and saying, I can do this in my city. You know, you don't need me there. You know, it's meant to build the community. So yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right here.
Yes, hi. I want to ask a question from the perspective of writers and also young academics. Because writers and young academics suffer a lot of struggles in their process. They deal with a whole lot of rejection early on. And then when they have a book finally accepted for publication, they have to go through the very difficult thing of publicizing that book, which is hard for a writer. We're introverts, right? So I want to know what you guys are doing to kind of extend more caritas to young writers and academics that come into your fold.
And we have about 3 minutes, so just keep that.
Yeah, I think there's a continuity, right, between this question and the previous one, which is how do we how do we create a sort of understanding of this this difficult thing that is in a way costly, right? It's people are giving many years of their lives, of their youth, to forming themselves to be able to contribute to this culture, right? And then often finding that the doors they hoped would be open or closed, right? And there's just a certain amount of human limitation in how much you can do, but I think there's nothing like the disposition of active receptivity, just like being willing to hear somebody out as they tell you, right? This is what I went through to get this book. Try to find someone for this book, and this is how many publishers I went to, and this is how many. This again is another community building exercise, right? Just to be there as a sort of support system. Right? It's maybe as simplistic. It sounds simplistic as I'm saying it, but if you've had the benefit of it, I certainly know. We alluded to this earlier. Joshua was there for me at a time when I was in a kind of despondency about whether my own work would ever be anything but a few pixels in a folder, right, on a hard drive that nobody would ever see, right? So it's bigger than you think when you do that, I want to say.
Just one other thing too. I think that again, I'm allergic to self-promotion, but I had to learn how to self-promote and also to teach our authors how to do the same. There was a study that came out this past year that demonstrated that even if you land a book with the big five in New York, they invest something like 90% upwards of their marketing muscle to just a handful of books, right? And then they neglect everyone else and they have to sort of do it on their own. So we have a whole kind of onboarding packet to teach writers, and our authors are required to plan 3 literary events. That's part of their contractual agreements, right? Because they are introverted and they will retreat into their beds and wait for the reviews to arrive and be frustrated when they don't. The final thing that I would say is I think that fraternal correction is a form of charity. And so some of what we need to do is reject people. And not to do so glibly, not to do so with a kind of menacing delight, but there are. Flannery O'Connor said it best, right? Do our cultural institutions, sort of buoy up enough writers? She said they don't stifle enough of them, and I think that's absolutely still true.
Maybe a good segue from that is if you have a book of poems, do not hesitate to email me because we do 24 book reviews in each issue every year. So don't forget about it. Just reach out, a simple email. I love to hear from people, so it's great. I think sometimes people are afraid to contact the publishers because, yeah, they think they should be approached, but don't wait.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking them, the panelists.